مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. أفكار كبيرة حول الأصل الإركي والعدالة والفرص والمجتمع. الجمهوريون والديمقراطيون يجدون أرضية مشتركة لأجل الأمة. أمريكا باعتبارها نور يهدي الأمم. هذه مفاهيم محفورة في التاريخ الأمريكي، وإن حالفنا الحظ في مستقبلنا أيضا. ولكن الأفكار يلزمها أشخاص، مفكرون عظام أو منظمون عظام أو خطباء عظام أو زعماء عظام لتصبح حراكا للتغيير. حظينا بمثل هؤلاء الرجال والنساء في الماضي، ولتحقيق النجاح في القرن ال21 سنحتاج إليهم مجددا في المستقبل. جاك كيمب عضو كونغرس من نيويورك توفي عام 2009 كان زعيما على هذه الشاكلة. هذا النجم السابق لكرة القدم الأمريكية انتقل إلى الحياة السياسية، وقد فادت نفسه بالعمل والتفاؤل والأفكار. لو كان رونالد ريغان صورة الحزب الجمهوري الجديد، فقد كان جاك كيمب قلبه وعقله. مورت كندراكي صديقنا القادم في برنامج داخل واشنطن كتب سيرة جديدة لحياة جاك كيمب، تعرض صورة هي لهذا البطل الأمريكي. حين نعود سنناقش حياته وإرثه. Welcome back to Dakhil, Washington. I'm delighted to welcome back Mort Kondracki, one of our original panelists, our panel of political experts. But here today, we're here to talk about Mort's new book on Jack Kemp.
Who was Jack Kemp?
Who was Jack Kemp, and why did he deserve so much time and effort on your part to give him a biography?
Okay, so the first sentence of the book is that Jack Kemp was the most important politician of the 20th century who was not president, certainly the most important, influential Republican. That's a big statement. So why? He was the original and the most active advocate for supply-side economics. Now, you have to go back to the 1970s and remember what things were like in America. You had very high unemployment, you had astronomical inflation, you had very slow growth, you had hostages in Iran, you had the Soviets advancing in Afghanistan, you had morale in 1979 was only 13% of the American people were satisfied with the direction of the country. Nowadays, unhappy as we are, it's 30. And economists didn't know what to do about inflation, and presidents didn't know what to do about inflation. Kemp borrowed from economists Robert Mundell, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, and Arthur Laffer, and came up with the formula of bringing down the top or all income tax rates. The top rate in those days was 70%. So then he persuaded Ronald Reagan to adopt this formula. Reagan did. The top rate went from 70 to 50 and then down to 28, and we had 2 decades of prosperity. I mean, growth surged, and that enabled Reagan to finance a defense buildup, which ultimately toppled the Soviet Union. And at the end of Reagan's term, the whole world believed that democratic capitalism was the way to go, and the American people, the satisfaction rate was up to 69%. Now, Reagan is the one who did put it into effect, but Kemp was the one who gave him the idea with which to do it. So
your basic argument is that peace and prosperity in the 20th century came from Jack Kemp.
Well, he triggered it, yes. And you know, so you start lining up. We give Hubert Humphrey and Edward Kennedy credit as being perhaps on his level among Democrats, but it's hard to think of any Republican who matches him Earl Warren would surpass him, but that was as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, not as Governor of California.
Let's talk a bit about Kemp. So Kemp started his career far from politics, in a very different playing field.
Right,
as it
exactly.
were.
He was a pro football quarterback for the Buffalo Bills, and he had been a phys ed major in college.
It's physical education.
Physical education, and he was a very mediocre student, but he started reading, and he read and he read and he read and he read, and by the time, he instead of reading Sports Illustrated or Playboy magazine on team planes, he would be reading economic tomes, right?
So even as a player, he was already interested in the political world.
Yeah, exactly. And his family was Republican from the beginning, and he got an internship with Ronald Reagan while he was a football player, early in his football career, and he knew a lot of politicians, and so he just got interested, and he was voracious. I mean, he was reading all the time, and
he's not from a part of the country which is at the heart of national media and politics, correct?
Buffalo, New York.
Buffalo, New York.
Right. But the plight of people in Buffalo, a Rust Belt town which was losing its industry and increasing unemployment, and during the 70s, is what got him looking for solutions. And first, it got him into tax policy. And his colleagues in the House, especially the senior ones, detested the idea that this backbencher was treading on their turf. And so, he exuded an incredible optimism, both that he could do anything that he worked hard enough to do. And he was indefatigable. On the football field, they could be losing 35-0, fourth quarter, and he would still say to his team, "We can do this, we can do this, we can." And the same thing with Congress. I mean, he pushed and pushed and pushed on supply side economics, and finally converted his party, and finally converted Reagan. So he was, he was energy personified.
So would you characterize Jack Kemp as an ideologue, as a pragmatist? Where do you put him on that spectrum?
He was actually both. He had a lot of fights with the Reagan White House. The Reagan White House, led by James Baker, who later became Secretary of State, was always compromising with Democrats in Congress, and was willing to raise taxes after the initial deep cuts of 1981. And Kemp was always resisting. And James Baker and Ronald Reagan himself called Jack Kemp an ideologue. He believed what he believed. So in that sense, he was an ideologue. However, he also operated across party lines a lot. He was the favorite Republican among the members of the Black Caucus. He was pro-civil rights. He was in favor of letting illegal immigrants with clean records become citizens. And so in that sense, he was a pragmatist.
So I wanted to talk to you a bit about that, because Jack Kemp, from my memory, was always known as an inclusivist.
Yeah.
We need to expand the party.
Yeah. The subtitle of the book is "The Bleeding Heart Conservative Who Changed America."
So bleeding heart, it's an American term. What does that mean?
That mean a bleeding heart is somebody who cares about poor people, who cares about blacks and cares about minorities and wants to include them. He wanted the Republican Party to once again become the party of Abraham Lincoln. He honestly believed, and I think this was fanciful or romantic, that black Americans who, after the Civil War, voted Republican all the way until the Great Depression, that he thought that they could be enticed back into the Republican Party if the economy grew enough. And he was all about economic growth. So he thought that if a rising tide would lift all boats, and African Americans would, see their incomes rising, that they would give the Republican Party credit for it and return to the Republican Party. That obviously never happened, but nonetheless, that was his mentality. And it was said of him that as a football player, he had showered with more African Americans than most Republicans had ever met. And he was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and wanted a conservative war on poverty, which you could never get George H.W. Bush, president, to do, but that's why he's a bleeding heart.
So you mentioned briefly how his relationship with other Republicans evolved, to put it mildly, both intellectually and on a personal level. He eventually, as you just said, made it to the cabinet, nominated by
George H.W. Bush.
So not under Ronald Reagan.
No, he was the #3 leader of House Republicans under Reagan. And as I said, there was a lot of friction on foreign policy as well as domestic. He was a super hawk. He ran for president in 1988 against George H.W. Bush,
who was Ronald Reagan's vice president.
Right. And Reagan practically endorsed Bush. I mean, in so many words, endorsed him. And the Republican Party in those days was a primogeniture party. You know, the next guy in line gets to be the king.
But before we get there, George Bush did nominate him to his cabinet.
Yes.
And how did that experience go?
You know, it was said of him that he was the only Secretary of Housing in American history with his own foreign policy. and he had his fork in everybody else's plate. He wanted to pronounce upon economic policy and foreign policy and monetary policy and so on. And he was, and he would talk up at cabinet meetings and just burst in. And Jim Baker, the Secretary of State then, had enormous fights with him, especially over the Middle East. I mean, Baker was trying to work out some sort of peace plan between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and Kemp was best friends with Benjamin Netanyahu, and resisted, you know, any implication that the Palestinians would ever have a state, for sure, but even he was against autonomy even. So,
all right, well, we're going to come back and we'll talk about the latter life of Jack Kemp, and most importantly, what his legacy may be today, in just a moment. My guest today is Mort Kondracki. Mort is the author of this fine new book, Jack Kemp, the bleeding heart conservative who changed America. In an extraordinary journalism career that spanned, well, a very long time, Mort served as the executive editor and columnist for the Capitol Hill newspaper Roll Call, the Washington bureau chief of Newsweek, senior editor of the New Republic, and columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He also held the Jack Kemp Chair in Political Economy at the Library of Congress, and he has been a panelist on Dakhel, Washington for all of our 10 years.
And happily so.
And happily so. So he finally made it on a presidential ticket as vice president in one of the great losing campaigns of our time in 1996. Yeah. How did he fare, just in that role?
Not well. He had the idea that the Republican Party should appeal to minorities. There were not very many votes to be had in Harlem or the south side of Chicago, but he insisted on going to those places because it was part of his ideology. In other words, he was not following the playbook of Bob Dole, who was the presidential candidate. He was in favor of immigration reform, and Bob Dole wanted to appeal to the nativist wing of the electorate, and so they were at odds about that. You know, he basically ran his own campaign on a Kemp platform, not the Dole platform. But the worst of it was that Bill Clinton, who was going to get elected president no matter what, because the country was at peace and there was prosperity, had a lot of ethical issues, and they were not the sexual issues that later came up. The worst of them was, and it was all over the press, that the Democratic National Committee was collecting money from foreign sources, from Indonesia, from China, and this was being raised knowingly by Clinton through various connections. It's illegal, and it was all over the papers. And Dole, because Dole had the reputation of being a snarling bad guy, avoided attacking Clinton. So it's the natural role of the vice presidential candidate to be an attack dog. Kemp never attacked anybody. Kemp was incapable of negative campaigning. He could not say anything bad about anybody. So he gets into the vice presidential debate with Al Gore, and the first question is, what about Clinton's ethics, in effect? And Jack Kemp says, Bob Dole and I are not going to go low road. We believe that our adversaries, that our opposition is our adversaries, not our enemies. So I'm not going to comment on that. And it, his assignment was to be firm, be tough, in the debate. And everybody in the Dole campaign just wilted at that moment. The first question of the debate, he lost. So he was not a successful vice presidential candidate.
But I have to ask, so not a successful vice presidential candidate, when he was a cabinet member.
Not a successful cabinet.
So was his high watermark before he went into national life and he was still a congressman?
Yeah, I mean, his high watermark in influence was when he was a congressman. I mean, it's significant. The top income tax rate was 70%. 70% of your income would go to the government. Now, not everybody paid it because they had all these dodges, but nonetheless, that was the statutory rate, and it was brought down to 50, and then it was brought down to 28, and the economy boomed. So that was his major contribution, but also there was a spirit about him of optimism, inclusiveness, compassion. He was the original compassionate conservative, and he lent this spirit to a significant portion of the Republican Party, especially younger members of Congress. It was, instead of being a negative, austerity-minded party, he wanted it to become, as I said, the party of Lincoln, a growth-oriented party, a party that included everybody and created opportunity for everybody.
That was the word I was going to ask you about. It's the word that I most closely associate with Jack Kemp, which is opportunity, which is almost a word of biblical proportions in some parts of the Republican Party.
Right.
What did it mean for Kemp, this concept of opportunity?
Well, I mean, it was, Lincoln said that the idea of America is that everyone should be able to rise according to their talent and their industry. And Kemp was a Lincoln worshiper, and he profoundly believed that. So what you had to do, and he was almost an economic determinist. I mean, he was an idealist in the sense that he took that Lincoln prescription, but his means were, and his evaluation of things were economic. He thought, as John F. Kennedy said, that a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So if you could get economic growth going, that the country would, that everybody would benefit, that everybody would be able to rise, that people in the ghetto would have jobs, and they would be able to send their kids to college, and so on. And so he said that when economies are stagnant, what politics consists of pitting one group against another, black against white, north against south, rich against poor, and we're seeing it now. We have a stagnant economy, and people are pitting other people against Mexican immigrants and against the Chinese, against the rich, the 41%, 47% who are recipients of government benefits, against the 1% who are the very rich, et cetera. And we're a divided society.
And so are there any Kempians in American politics today? Who might they be?
Well, Paul Ryan, the vice presidential candidate in the last Republican ticket, was a Kemp intern, and I happen to know that he spends one day a week traveling around in ghetto America, black communities, trying to understand what it is that could solve the problem of poverty and social dislocation. He's done it sort of quietly, but nonetheless he's done it. He's got the Kemp spirit, and he's also a growth guy. He believes in tax reform, so he would be the closest. But there among the presidential candidates, I think John Kasich is governor of Ohio, is talking about growth as the answer, and is in favor of immigration reform. Jeb Bush is in the same area. Marco Rubio, from time to time, shows indications of being a Kempian. So there are some around, and unfortunately, they're not the ascendant candidates. I mean, Donald Trump is the antithesis of Jack Kemp in every way except high energy. I mean, he's anti-immigration, he's anti-free trade, he insults people. Kemp never insulted anybody, et cetera, et cetera.
Mort, congratulations on your new book.
Thank you.
And delighted to have you back here on Dakhel, Washington.
Well, it's so much fun. Thank you.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول أفكار جاك كيمب للنمو والفرص، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.